back to Hoffman Reproductions. My name is Ben Hoffman, and once again, thank you for joining in with us today. On today's episode, we're going to revisit the subject of 18th century leather dye. We had a question from a subscriber a while back that asked if we had any kind of a recipe for brown, as that's a very popular color, so that's what we're going to dive into today. Before we get started on the dyeing process, one thing to keep in mind is during the 18th century, it's not that they never did it, but brown was not as a common color to dye as we do today. And mainly the reason is they had a lot of brown colors just due to the fact of the natural dyeing process. They used a lot of vegetable tanning in the 18th century, and that in and of itself will yield shades of brown. When you've got red oak bark that they used a lot of, that's going to give it a reddish brown. Hemlocks would give various shades of brown, and they ranged from a light tan color clear to almost a black. So just the natural dyeing process that was used would yield those darker colors, and there was no need for dyeing. And then during the tanning process, they would use various oils and greases to break the leather down, and again, that would impart a darker brown color. So just naturally, a byproduct, they would get the darker shades. Now, most reenactors don't do their own tanning, so to get those traditional colors, we have to come up with a dye to achieve them. One that is very common amongst reenactors, pretty much everybody has fooled around with it at one time or another if you've been involved in 18th century reenacting, is black walnut hull dye. And I've got some of the little buggers right here, black walnut hulls. These grow and fall all across the United States. In Ohio we have a large abundance of these things. They're not hard to find. They're a nuisance to most people, but for 18th century reenactors they're very handy for producing shades of brown. Of course, your clothing, again, I said most reenactors have messed around with it to a degree, dyeing clothing, but you can also use it in leather. Now, you can't quite go about it in the same fashion as fabric dyeing. You have to make your dye much stronger to get decent shades of brown on leather, as is my experience anyway. So I like to gather the walnut hulls and then let them dry. If you gather them in their green or fresh, I found that tends to give leather or even clothing a little bit of a greenish cast, which isn't bad if you're dyeing a hunting shirt or something, but most reenactors don't want their leather gear to have a greenish shade, so I like to let them dry out. And also they're much easier to harvest. You can just throw the whole thing in there. I typically will go ahead and pull the hull off. You can see that's dry and pops right off, and process them that way. But you're going to need a few things for this to work. Of course, you're going to need a supply of walnut hulls. How many depends on how big of a dye vat that you want to create. You're going to need some type of a kettle or big pot that is fire safe or stove safe. You can do this process either on an open fire or just on your stove at home. And to get a good strong dye, I found that you have to fill up whatever type of a kettle you're using about halfway full, again, of the shelled or hulled walnuts. About halfway up of the walnut hull, and then fill it the rest of the way up with water. And you want that at a low boil. I'll typically leave it for several hours. And the key to getting this dye to work on leather, again, there's no chemicals involved here, it's all natural, is you need to reduce that water level on down and really pull all of the dye you possibly can out of the walnuts. So if you make it in kind of a watery solution that typically you might use on fabric, it's not going to work very well when it goes to trying to use it on leather. You need to reduce that water level by about half is where I found works. So again, whatever size kettle you're going to use, this one's about 3 gallons or so, but half full walnuts filled with water, and then reduce that water level down by half so you get a very strong concentrated dye bath that you can use this leather in. After you've done that, I will typically go ahead and strain out the walnut hulls through a mesh screen. The reason being, if you do this, and you leave the hulls in there, this dye is going to tend to want to rot fairly quickly because again, there's no preservatives added. So the natural byproduct there, it's not going to have a real long shelf life in water. These will start to rot and ferment and get a really nasty odor to it. So I'll strain the dye bath through a screen mesh, same kind of, you can buy it at any hardware store or Home Depot or Lowe's, just the screen mesh for replacing window screens and whatnot. That works great. Or a coffee filter, but that would take a really long time, and you don't really need to filter it out that fine. So the screen mesh works good. And then you want to set it aside and let it cool off. If you put your leather in the hot dye bath, it's going to tend to mess your leather up. If you can put your hand in it and it's not too hot to your hand, and you're okay, you can go ahead and add your leather to that. But when you put it in there, and this is what you need to plan ahead, it's not going to be done instantaneously. This process, I found, takes anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks of soaking to get a good brown color. Again, it's all natural dye, it's relatively weak, there's no chemicals involved, so you have to be patient with it. Also, when you put your leather in, you don't want it all mashed together with a bunch of other leather. You'll get uneven dye spots, which maybe you're after if you want kind of a molted, broken up appearance, but I like a nice, even dye color. So several times a day you're going to want to agitate this, or as often as you can, and mix the leather up so that it dyes evenly. Now again, as I said, it takes some time to achieve good colors with this dye process, but you really don't want to leave it much longer than 2 weeks because of using the walnut hulls. There's tannin involved, meaning this will continue to tan your leather the longer you leave it in there. If you leave it in longer than about 2 weeks, what's going to happen is what's called case hardening. And case hardening means that the surface of the leather will become hard and brittle, which certain applications some guys will use for like knife sheaths and whatnot, but I've found it's really not very practical because it will crack very, very easily. So you have to be careful, and around that 2 week level, whatever you got, you want to pull it out of there and rinse it off and call it good, because any longer than that it tends to start again becoming brittle and case hardening. Now different leathers will work differently in this dye bath. A very tightly grained calf hide may take a long time and not soak up much dye. More open porous leather like a buckskin or pigskin will soak up a lot. And being natural, every time I do this you get a slightly different shade, so you're not sure what you're going to get unless you just go ahead and try it and hope for the best. But again, about 2 weeks is the maximum, and when you take it out of the dye bath and you rinse it off, I'll usually just use a hose outside. As it's drying, you don't want it too close to a heat source because that will make it become brittle. And what I'll do as it's drying, I'll usually take, and this is neat's foot oil, 100% pure neat's foot oil. I'll put a coat of neat's foot oil on it as it's drying. If you don't do that, it can dry and become rather brittle. So I find that really helps as the water is evaporating, you're replacing it with oil. That helps the color, and it also helps the leather stay soft and pliable. So one little step there. But just to show you a couple different examples here, this is what I typically use when I'm sewing a lot of projects, like a shooting bag. This is 3/4 ounce oak tan leather. It hasn't been dyed. Here's the same type of leather. This has been in the dye bath for a little while. Not a huge difference, but a nice tan color going there. And this one was in there, I think, 4 or 5 days or so before I took it out. And applying the oil and the finishing waxes, we could get this a little bit darker color, but just a contrast difference there to show you. And then this piece has gone a little bit longer, and you can see it's a little bit darker. And again, if we hit that with more oils and finishing waxes, we can get it a darker color. But I've been able to achieve colors with this dye everywhere from a light tan all the way up to almost a black color. Again, every leather is different. You have to experiment. You need to be careful, not leave it in there too long. But the main thing when dyeing leather with this dye is you need it strong. You need to reduce it farther down than you would if you were dyeing fabric, because the leather grain is much more of a dense material than fabric, so you need a good strong dye. But make sure you don't leave it in there too long, and also it helps to put a coat of oil on it as it's drying. So if you do all that, it's a relatively quick, inexpensive period correct, which is what we're after when we do these kind of things. Formula to get your leather goods a nice dark brown color that is popular today and historically existed as well. So that's going to wrap it up here for today. Thank you all once again for joining in with us. We really appreciate everybody's support. I just want to remind you all, if you'd care to subscribe, please feel free to do that. That way you'll get notifications when we post new videos, and you won't be caught off guard and have to search for it or anything. You'll get a notification right there to your email. But next time we plan to do a knife forging process, so I'm going to take you through my process of hand forging and fitting and whatnot of a knife, so you're going to want to make sure and stay tuned for that if that sounds fascinating. So until next time, thanks once again, and take care everybody.